Hey everyone, this is Chapter 4 Introduction to Quantitative Research. So, we have read in previous chapters a little bit of the overview or the background of what research is, what kind of different paradigms in terms of social science paradigms that we communication researchers use, and we talked about research ethics in the previous chapter. So moving forward, chapter 4, we look at one of the first two paradigms of our focus in this course, being quantitative research is the focus and emphasis in today's lecture. In this lecture, we'll be talking about things about the central analytical framework of quantitative research, and it will be different than qualitative research. But we are not interested or worried about qualitative research at this point for today. We'll save that for another day, right? We'll be also talking about what hypotheses are in relation to null hypothesis. We'll be talking about how concepts evolve to become constructs, and then how they are variables. How do they become variables? And what are the relationships between the variables, and we can talk about independent variables and dependent variables. How are they related to each other, and how do these variables relate to the idea about hypotheses? So those are things that we'll be looking at, as well as some of the advantages and disadvantages of doing quantitative research. So that's a brief overview of what we'll be expecting today in today's lecture, and we'll dive in right now. What is quantitative research? In quantitative research, our interest is in numerical or things that we can count, things that we can quantify, therefore the name quantitative research. So things that we can measure, things that we count, and essentially the unit of analysis are things that are compared to different things that we collect. So if we look at the list of words right here, amounts, frequencies, degrees, values, intensity, what do these words tell us? They tell us that we're measuring things that we collect, and they have some relationship to each other because you can establish one being greater than the other. So for instance, say I have a $5 note and I have a $10 note. Okay, so we see that the value of the $10 note is greater because it's worth more. So you see, we're comparing quantitatively two different things, and we can measure which one is greater or lesser, stronger or weaker, that sort of thing. There's some kind of degree to it. There's some kind of way for us to establish which one is in some sense larger or smaller than the other thing. And that is the heart of quantitative research. We're able to measure them based on the units that we are collecting and analyzing between the measurements or the data that we collect. Quantitative research applies statistical analysis, so we use statistics for the purpose of getting greater precision. So meaning to say, when we have numbers, for example, comparing 5 versus 10, then we have some precision because we know that 10 is greater than 5. Therefore, 10 is more than 5. And because of the greater precision that we can gain from using statistics and using numerical analysis, we have the perception that quantitative research is more objective as compared to qualitative research. But this element of objectivity at some level is true, yet at some level it's really kind of like a myth or something that we try to believe to be true, because we know that when we interpret data, even if they are numerical, they are quantitative, Interpretation depends on how the person reads, how the researcher reads the numbers, and what kind of analysis is applied. So, in some sense, at a high level, it's objective, it's perceived as objective, but really at a level that we can, if we want to tease out the nuances, it can be rather subjective as well, just like qualitative research. A key point about quantitative research is that it's based on a deductive model. So we apply the deductive reasoning that we have spent. Components of quantitative research. First of all, we have to have an overall purpose or objective. So the research problem that the researcher has in terms of thinking what is the big picture question or big picture problem or issue that the researcher is curious to find out, to study. And after establishing that, having that big picture view of what is the big picture thing, the abstract idea that the researcher wants to study, then the researcher has to dive into the literature to have a sense about how other researchers have talked about on this topic. So either perhaps some kind of scholarly analysis or some empirical work that other researchers have done on that area of work. And based on that literature, the researcher can then construct his or her research questions and or hypotheses. Recall that quantitative research typically involves or almost always involves hypotheses or hypothesis if there's only one. Sometimes we may use research question or questions depending on how much literature is out there on that specific topic of interest. So sometimes quantitative researchers may apply or use the research questions, but mostly they will use hypotheses. If they were to do a study that involves or includes research questions, usually that complements with one or more hypotheses that is part of that same study. And after we have constructed our hypothesis, or if we include research questions, then those elements here, the research questions, hypotheses, they drive the research design in a way that it helps a researcher determine what would be the appropriate method or methods. So most research is based on the problem that the researcher wants to study, what has been written in the literature by other researchers, what is the research question and or hypothesis that the researcher wants to apply to this work, and then that then drives the researcher towards the appropriate or the most useful method to conduct that study. Okay, and ultimately, especially for quantitative research, the language that we use in terms of how useful or how legitimate, how true the data is, we use the words validity and reliability of the data. We're interested in the validity and reliability of the data to help us know how concrete or how true or how reliable or how useful the data is in relation to answering the hypotheses and research questions. So we'll look at validity and reliability at a later slide today. Here we have the conceptual model for quantitative research. So recall in previous slide, we start off with a purpose, a research problem that we're interested to pursue. We investigate what other researchers have done in this area of work. And you notice that there is this two-way arrow. So it's not just one way from purpose to literature, but the researcher can then also backtrack to either revise or to tweak the purpose that the researcher wants to use to inform the research. So the researcher can go back and forth since this is a two-way arrow, or the researcher could move from purpose to literature, and then once he or she has read the literature and understands that what other researchers have done, and without needing to tweak his or her purpose, can then move on to this box here to design or construct the relevant hypotheses or hypotheses, and as well as research questions if they're necessary. After constructing those hypotheses and research questions, then it leads to the researcher identifying the appropriate method or methods, and after which the data collection process will begin and pursuing the validity and reliability of the data. Again, the researcher can also move back towards methods again if it is necessary to tweak the study or perhaps add an additional method or an additional way of collecting data so that we can establish or raise higher validity and reliability. So this is a visual demonstration of what we have talked about in the previous slide. Okay, so the foundation for quantitative research, first of all, abstract ideas or thinking, usually we'll call those terms concepts. Okay, so ideas that we have, if some of those big picture abstract ideas, we can call them concepts. So those are the most fundamental pieces of the elements that we're going to study, and they build up all the way to operationalization, and we'll walk through all these steps together. And a concept becomes a construct. The concept becomes a construct only when it is related or linked to other concepts. So if you have your text and on page 62, figure 4.2, you see that concepts such as children, violence, and TV, those are concepts, and concepts exist independent from other concepts. They are by themselves. They are not related to anything as yet at this point. They're independent from one another, so they are only known as concepts. But the concepts, or each concept, becomes a construct when they have some kind of meaningful link between them. So if we put the concepts children, violence, and TV together and string them together to make some kind of meaningful link or connection between them, then they become a construct, and we see how they are a construct and becomes variables in a hypothesis. If we think about children, if we have a hypothesis that says children are influenced by violence on TV. So you see that I'm stringing the three original concepts, children, violence, and TV, into a hypothesis, which is children are influenced by violence on TV. That is a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that children are influenced by violence on TV. We're putting the concepts together, and that allows us to hypothesize there is some kind of relationship. We're predicting by some educated guess that is some kind of relationship between the TV programs or things that children watch on TV and the influence on violence. So we see how concepts become constructs, and once they are constructs, they become elements that we string together as variables in our hypotheses. Now, when we string the hypotheses together using the variables, they are not quite useful or not quite testable yet. Reason because we still do not know how to observe those variables. So therefore, we introduce the term operationalization. So what that means is that when we operationalize the variable or the variable, that means that we're making it easily or a way that we can observe or measure it, a way that we can measure or observe it. So for example, when we operationalize children, the concept children, which we then have been used as a variable in a hypothesis, we can operationalize it by using different ways of categorizing children. For example, public school children, or private school children, or homeschool children. You see that when we operationalize children, the concept children, we are giving them some characteristics that we can observe or measure or identify to separate children from this category from children from another category. Another example that we have for violence, to operationalize violence, is to say that violence could be seen as either video game violence or cartoon violence or dramatic violence. So you see again, we operationalize violence, the concept violence, in ways that we can identify something unique from one type of violence to another type of violence. So here we have the foundation of quantitative research, moving from concept to construct to what a variable is, and then moving to operationalization. With our variables, we can then plug them into our hypotheses and our research questions. But what is an hypothesis? A hypothesis is an educated guess or some kind of presumption that the researcher is making based on his or her reading of the literature. So based on what other researchers have done, what they have studied on this specific topic, the researcher tries to construct some kind of relationship, or there might be some kind of difference between the variables that he or she is wanting to study. Or stating that there might be some kind of relationship, as we note right here, or some kind of difference, so some kind of significant difference between variables. And if we are trying to make some kind of connection between relationships as well as difference, then there must be at least two or more variables in the hypothesis. A research study, therefore, is designed to test the relationship or perhaps the existence of a difference between the variables as described in the hypothesis. So now that we have looked at hypotheses, there are two types of hypotheses for us to consider. The first type is the directional hypothesis. Directional hypothesis tells us that there is some kind of direction, as the name implies. There's some kind of relationship of the direction between the relationship or difference between the variables. For example, if we say the more chocolate you eat, the happier you'll be, you see that there's a direction because the increase of chocolate consumption makes one feel happier. Okay, so the consumption of chocolate makes one feel happier. There's a direction. The more chocolate consumed makes a person happier. So there is a direction. The other type of hypothesis that we know is called the non-directional hypothesis. And the non-directional hypothesis indicates that there is some kind of influence between the variables, but we are still not quite sure, or we are not ready to commit that there is some kind of direction to the relationship between the variables. So for instance, a non-directional hypothesis can look like this. The consumption of chocolate has an influence on people's happiness. So you see that there is something about chocolate consumption and a person's feeling of happiness. There's some kind of relationship existing. We think there is, but we're not quite sure if eating more means you become happier or eating more means that you'll feel less happy. We don't know, or at least in this non-directional hypothesis example, we are not sure if there will be an increase or decrease, but we were guessing, educated guess, that there is some kind of relationship, just that we're not too sure, or we are not ready to commit to one direction or the other. So there you have two types of research hypotheses, directional and non-directional. How do we assess hypotheses? We want to make sure that hypotheses are clear and they are capable of helping us, directing us to understand the relationship between the variables. So is it simply stated, meaning to say, is it a simple question or statement? There is not a lot of other elements or variables that make it overly complex. So simple sentences or questions are usually good. Is it a single sentence, meaning to say we're not adding different ways of measuring things, or we are not comparing multiple variables in one single sentence. Okay, example could be the more chocolate you eat makes you happy, but it also makes you lose lots of money, but you also gain weight. So you see that it's kind of convoluted. There's a lot of variables involved. There's a lot of relationship between the consumption of chocolate, so that would not be a good hypothesis. Okay, are there at least two variables? Good hypothesis must have at least two variables. I think that good hypotheses usually have just two variables, just to keep things really simple. But the first principle up here. Are the variables clearly stated? Again, if variable is well understood in the literature, we can see the progression from being a construct, or rather from a concept to a construct and becoming variable. Is the hypothesis clearly telling us that there is an educated guess, based on the educated guess, that there is a relationship or perceived difference between the variables? And finally, is the hypothesis testable, meaning to say, are the variables operationalized? And what do we mean by that? We mean that if it's operationalized, it means that it's made in a way so that we can observe and measure those variables by something. By something either we collect, or we observe, or we hear, or we touch. Okay, something that we can empirically measure or observe. Now that we talked about hypotheses, know that hypotheses sometimes are also known as research hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis. So what is the null hypothesis? The null hypothesis essentially is the statement that the researcher is trying to reject. Research studies that does or uses quantitative research methods, they do not state the null hypothesis. They only state the research or the alternative hypothesis. But in reality, they're trying to disprove or trying to reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is in direct contrast or opposition to the research hypothesis. They're stating that unless demonstrated by the empirical evidence collected by the researcher, there is no relationship or difference between the variables. So for instance, if I have this research hypothesis, the more chocolate you consume, the happier you'll be, then the null hypothesis is saying that there is no relationship between chocolate consumption and your happiness. There's no relationship. There's nothing between the variables. There's no connection. Okay? So if we are saying that, that is the null hypothesis. Researchers conduct the studies to collect evidence to demonstrate that the hypothesis is true, that there is a relationship between chocolate consumption and happiness. But until that is demonstrated, the null hypothesis is assumed to be true or to be accurate. That is, there is no relationship or difference between the variables in the hypothesis. Part of the research tradition of using hypotheses is that hypotheses are always tentative, meaning to say they're not always fixed. Why so? Reason because knowledge is always evolving, is always being added, is always growing. So that when we learn new knowledge, hypotheses, the relationship between the variables can change. So hypotheses are not always fixed, they are always tentative. Research questions or the research hypothesis is always the focus of the research and reported research report, not the null hypothesis. But essentially what the researcher does is to try to reject the null hypothesis. Why do we use research questions in quantitative research? Sometimes we may use research questions because the phenomenon that we're studying is not well known or not well studied. There are a lot of pieces to it that we still do not understand, and therefore we use a research question or questions to help us dig or find out more information or knowledge, or to extend further knowledge. There might be conflicting results between previous studies, so there's no consistent theme or explanation. They are all conflicting. Therefore, researchers might use a research question to help to find out which way does it really lean towards. And research questions are useful because it helps us to describe communication phenomena. Research questions drives research that is usually more descriptive. So research questions are also used sometimes in quantitative research for these reasons. So variables, again, they are elements that we identify, that we use in hypothesis and research questions. The properties of those variables are things that or elements that we can measure or observe in terms of quality or some magnitude. Again, back to the previous an earlier slide, based on some kind of degree or intensity between the variables. Must have two or more levels. What that means is that it's measurable. There's something that helps us to grade, to see if there is greater or lesser or stronger or weaker, that kind of thing. There's some kind of gradient, there's some kind of progression to help us see the difference, the value in terms of value, in terms of the intensity. And variables must be identified as either independent or dependent. And we'll look at them a little bit closer next. Independent variables are the variables that the researcher manipulates or makes changes to. And the reason why the researcher manipulates or makes changes to an independent variable is because the researcher believes that any change or tweak to the independent variable or the IV would have an effect on the dependent variable or the DV. Technically, we reserve the label or the term independent variable for experimental designs, and don't have to worry about what experimental designs mean right now because we'll spend a full chapter looking at experiments. But know that the term independent variable typically is reserved to use for research that's done in an empirical experimental setting. But sometimes we might use the independent variable label quite loosely. It's also quite likely that researchers might use one of these terms right here to describe the IV. But again, generally, it is more common that you see that researchers will use the terms IV, and when you see IV, you know that what that means is that it is the manipulation or the change, the variation that the researchers introduces into the study in hopes to see that that might influence the DV. So what is the DV or the dependent variable? The DV is really the primary interest of the study, the focus of the study, the emphasis or the interest of the study about how it can be affected by other things. So when we say that the more chocolate you consume is going to increase your sense of happiness, for example, in the hypothesis, then the consumption of chocolate is really the IV, and the feeling of happiness is the DV, because you're interested to study what happens to a person's happiness and how they feel about happiness in relation to the consumption of chocolate. And so here we have the DV. We explain it as something that can be influenced or changed by the IV. DVs in the scientific community could be described or used in these other ways. We call it by different names, but when you see these other names, know that we are really talking about the DV. What is the relationship between IVs and DVs? Well, first of all, we cannot specify or we cannot understand the relationship between variables unless or until we can identify or label which ones are the IVs and which ones are the DVs. Okay, which ones are the ones that is the focus of the study, which is the DVs, and which ones are the variables that will influence the outcome of the DVs. So that will be the IV. The number of IVs and DVs in our study or hypothesis depends on the complexity of the study. Good studies can have a number of variables, but clear and simple, straightforward studies that are easy to understand, they usually just have one IV and one DV in one hypothesis. And if need be, they can have multiple hypotheses, but they really just have one IV and one DV in the hypothesis, in each of them. The number and type of variables also help us determine what kind of statistical tests will be appropriate or to be used to help us analyze the data collected. Don't have to worry about statistical tests at this point. Reason because in this chapter we're just interested in an overview of what quantitative research is and the pieces that form quantitative research. There are multiple ways to operationalize variables, so meaning to say there are different ways to measure or observe variables, as we talked about in a previous example. So, for example, we were talking about how to talk about violence, operationalize violence. The examples that we have were video game violence, cartoon violence, and dramatic violence. So those are three ways of operationalizing um, the variable violence, but you can imagine there are other ways as well to categorize or to have some characteristic of the violence that we want to study, observe. Key thing is it practical? Is it useful to operationalize a variable in a certain way? Is it easily or able to allow us to measure and observe them? Is there a justifiable argument for wanting to operationalize a variable in a certain characteristic or a certain nature? And does the operationalization coincide with the conceptual definition of the variable? So there are multiple ways, there are different ways to operationalize variables. All are acceptable as long as the researcher is able to justify why that explanation is relevant and how does it align with the conceptual definition of the variable. Why do we choose to do quantitative research? Several advantages. It is part of a long tradition coming from natural science research. They do experimental research, which is heavily quantitative. So, as social scientists, if we follow along that tradition, that allows us to make some kind of connection between what we do and as well as what has been done in the larger scientific community. There is some kind of implied rigor because the assumption that quantitative research is more objective. Quantitative research leans on statistical analysis, so those numbers allow us to have a high degree of precision or confidence about how the data that we collect, the variables, are able to be compared between one another. And we are able to generalize the findings based on the data that we collect because quantitative research depends on ideally random samples, and we will talk about samples in a future chapter. I think that will be chapter 6. Yep, we'll be talking about samples in chapter 6, but know that at least for this point, know that it is useful for us to do quantitative research, especially if we want to try to generalize the findings to the broader population. What is the disadvantage of doing quantitative research? Well, we cannot capture complexity of communication over time. It's much more difficult because quantitative research typically is more time dependent on a specific instance. It's hard to do it outside the lab, so there's the second point. Oftentimes, quantitative research is done in a very controlled environment or controlled setting. So if it's not in that controlled environment, the researcher will have a much more difficult time in studying the variables, and therefore it is much harder to capture the complexity because we know that communication, that as we understand human communication, happens in the real world, and a lot of elements are involved in making it complex and difficult to understand. Issues of reliability and validity. Reliability is essentially the consistency of the procedure that we do. So if something is reliable, it means that it's consistent. For example, if we say that if we are waiting for the metro train, for example, we say that it's reliable if it shows up at the station consistently at certain intervals or periods of time. So if it shows up consistently as scheduled, then we say the schedule of the metro train is reliable. On the other hand, the next concept about validity is issue about how true the findings that are or the data collected are. So if something is true or demonstrated to be accurate, then we say that the measurement is valid. In quantitative research, we try to achieve both. We want to have high validity and high reliability. studies that are high on reliability and validity, those are good aspects or good elements to demonstrate the design was rigorously designed and the data are useful to help us understand the relationship or difference between the variables. So we try to achieve that, and also that helps us to have some strong confidence that the data that we collect are free from systematic errors. What might be some threats to reliability and validity? The measurement device cannot make fine distinctions, meaning to say, let's say we ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like chocolate? Okay, some people might not really care about chocolate, so they are okay, they don't really care. So do they choose 5 or do they choose 6? What if they feel like 5.6 or they feel like 5.5? There is no measurement that's not offered to them. So if they can't choose 5.5 or 5.6, they might have to round up, or if they want to, they can round it down. Okay, so if the measurement device is not finite enough for them to measure the nuances, the fine details, then that is a potential threat to reliability and validity. Okay, can't capture the way that things differ as we described earlier. Sometimes those minute or small differences can have a large impact on the final findings of the study. Sources of variation can also affect those reliability and validity findings of a study. So the factors that we collect may not be measured. There might be some personal factors that affect the measurement that's been collected. Maybe it's the researcher who collects it, or the way that the participant understands the questions. So those are things that would affect the way the variables are understood and measured. So all in all, we have seen in this chapter different ways of operationalizing variables, and we know that variables evolve from concepts, and we move from concepts to constructs, and constructs become variables in hypotheses. We talk about how variables are either independent and dependent, and the relationship between the IV and the DV. That the DV is really the focus of the study, and the independent variable is the manipulation or variation that has been introduced to see if it has any impact on the DV. So that wraps up chapter 4.